Today, we're doing something a little different. We're going to look at the work of a modern philosophical giant, Peter van Inwagen. But we're not just going to read his ideas. Nope. We're actually going to build his entire worldview, piece by piece, like an architect, to see how he constructs reality itself from the ground up. So let's start with this one big idea. What if a philosopher didn't just have ideas, but built a complete system? I mean, a system for everything, from what it means to exist to whether we have free will, with the same precision an architect uses to design a skyscraper. That's exactly the blueprint we're going to follow today. And our architect? That would be Peter van Inwagen. In the world of modern metaphysics, this guy is a real heavyweight. He's known for taking on some of the biggest, most mind-bending questions out there. And his work isn't just a random collection of thoughts. It's a single interconnected structure. You can think of his philosophical house as having three main levels. It all starts with the foundation, right? That's his theory of being, what it even means to exist. Then, holding the whole thing up, is the central pillar, his really radical theory of composition, what things are actually made of. And at the very top, we've got the upper story, his ideas on human agency and free will. See? Each part rests on the one before it. Okay, so let's pour that foundation. Before we can even begin to talk about what's real, we have to agree on what it means for something to be real in the first place. This is the absolute bedrock of the entire project. Van Inwagen starts with something he calls the thin view of being. It's actually super simple. There's no sneaky difference between being and existing. If you can say something is, well then, it exists. Full stop. There aren't different flavors of reality. It's an all or nothing game. Now, this really simple rule leads to some, well, pretty wild conclusions. Let's take Mickey Mouse. You thinking he doesn't exist? Well, then Inwagen would say, yes, he absolutely does. Not as a talking mouse, of course, but as an abstract object. He makes this really clever distinction. In the story, Mickey holds the property of being a mouse, but in actual reality, he has the property of being an abstract creation of Walt Disney. So with that foundation firmly in place, it's time to put up the central, load-bearing pillar of the whole building. And let me tell you, this is where things get really, really controversial. We're moving from the question of that things exist to the question of how they exist as single objects. This whole section revolves around what Van Inwagen famously calls the special composition question. And put simply, it's this. When does a bunch of tiny little things like atoms or particles actually stop being a bunch of things and start being one single larger thing? When does a collection of parts truly become a whole? So he goes through all the obvious common sense answers and just tears them apart. Do things become one object just by touching? Nope. He says two people shaking hands don't magically create a new third object. Okay, well, what if they're stuck together, fastened, even superglued? He uses these brilliant little thought experiments to show that, surprisingly, none of our gut feelings about this actually hold up. And after he's knocked down every other possibility, he builds his own. And it is radical. He argues that the only time a collection of simple particles truly comes together to form one single composite object is when their combined activity creates a life. Yep, the only real composite objects are living organisms. And that leads to the really staggering punchline of his entire argument. If only living things are true objects, then tables, chairs, mountains, even planets, they don't actually exist. Not as single things anyway. They're just a bunch of tiny particles arranged chair-wise or rock-wise. So you exist, but the chair you're sitting on, technically, it doesn't. Okay, everybody take a deep breath. Because now, standing on top of that incredibly controversial pillar, we're heading up to the final level of our building, the world of human agency. How can a being like you, which is really just a collection of particles arranged in a very special way, actually have free will? To build his case, Van Inwagen creates this special little logical tool he calls the N operator. It's actually pretty straightforward. Whenever you see N in front of some statement, let's call it P, it just means that statement P is true, and it's a completely settled fact. Nobody, anywhere, at any time had any choice about it. It's totally unchangeable. So using that no choice tool, he builds his famous consequence argument. The logic is like a trap. It goes like this. Let's assume everything that happens is determined by two things: the state of the universe a long time ago, and the unbreakable laws of nature. Well, you definitely have no choice about the past, right? That's NFP0. And you have no choice about the laws of nature, NL. So it follows, you have no choice about those two things combined. And if your actions today are a necessary consequence of those things you can't change, well, then it seems you have no choice about your actions either. They're as fixed as the Big Bang itself. It's an incredibly powerful argument, right? But here's the twist. Then Inwangan also feels very strongly that we have to have moral responsibility, and that seems to demand free will, so he's trapped. He has powerful arguments that free will can exist, but he feels it must. So he's forced to conclude that free will is, and maybe always will be, a profound mystery. So there it is. The building is complete. We've got a foundation of being, a pillar of composition, and this top floor of agency. But now it's time to play inspector. Are there any cracks in this grand philosophical design? Let's take a look at one of the biggest challenges. Some critics, like the philosopher Christian List, argue that the consequence argument has a really deep structural flaw, what's called a category mistake. The basic idea is that Van Inwagen might be mixing up concepts from two totally different levels of reality, kind of like trying to screw a metric bolt into a standard-sized hole. It just doesn't fit. This helps us see the problem. The critics say that the past and the laws of nature belong to the super fine-grained physical level of reality, but that no-choice operator, the N, they argue that belongs to the coarse-grained agential level, the world of human beings making choices. The big worry here is that the argument applies a concept from our human world down to the level of fundamental physics, and if that's an error, the whole logical chain might just snap. So after all that, what are we supposed to make of this whole structure? Is it a perfect philosophical fortress? Or is it more like a fascinating, beautiful ruin? Let's step back for one final look. I think the final verdict is this. Van Inwagen has built an amazingly coherent, but deeply, deeply tense system. The conclusions he reaches about objects create real stress for his ideas about existence. And that whole top floor about free will might not even connect properly to the levels below it. But you know what? Its incredible value isn't about being perfect. Its value is in how those cracks and stresses show us the really profound, maybe even unsolvable problems that lie at the very heart of reality. Which leaves us with one last question to chew on. Maybe the whole point of philosophy isn't to build an unshakable fortress of ideas that has no flaws. Maybe the real genius lies in building something so bold and so clear that it allows all of us, for the very first time, to see exactly where the fault lines of reality have been all along.